Module 4, The Inverted Other and Self in the Works of Gwendolyn Brooks. Hear the echo. I think we need to reinvestigate Gwendolyn Brooks's discourse in terms of ownership and how her ownership of the Black tradition is a celebration of geography and demographics within societal stations of Black America. Gwendolyn Brooks skillfully uses this geography and demographic placement as the interiority to all activity when she poetically discourses on the inner and outer world. What I mean by inner world is that, quote, whether the speaker is a photographer, dancer, stonemason, fashion designer, teacher, trained engineer, listen for the moment of freedom, of self-revelation in their accounts when self emerges with something greater than self, unquote. In other words, the self in Miss Brooks's poems becomes being, authority, transcending what John Edgar Wideman calls minor characters in somebody else's melodrama. If we look briefly at Richard Wright, we can then gain a better understanding of Wideman's concept. In the historic novel Native Son, Wright's character, Bigger Thomas, is used for third-person commentary as an example of how, quote, Negroes had never been allowed to catch the full spirit of Western civilization, that they somehow live in it but not of it, unquote. In this context, African Americans are operating as other in Wright's polemic. However, I posit that Miss Brooks chooses to operate from an inverted construct of other. The outer world is only present as in the duality of existence, such as positive, negative, thesis, antithesis, and good, evil. Miss Brooks's observation about community not only realizes a self, but also creates an echo, a ripple into the future of the inner world, which can be considered theoretical foreshadowing. While in her book of essays, The Black Interior, Elizabeth Alexander beautifully points out that Miss Brooks, quote, was clearly committed to honoring the small details of ordinary lives and to seeking the plain beauty in surrounding others would ignore, unquote. I would like to take that quote one step further and re-articulate that with Miss Brooks, these lives were more than ordinary. In my opinion, they were extraordinary if we are to believe the poem she writes from her first collection, A Street in Bronzeville, A Song in the Yard. Not only is the poem an execution in tactical and taught language, but highlights a young speaker's infatuation with life outside of her front yard, a life of African-American negotiation with its inner self. The fact that this self is intriguing comes alive in the first stanza, which states, I stayed in the front yard all my life. I want to peek at the back, where it's rough and untended and hungry weeds grow. A girl gets sick of a rose. Clearly, Miss Brooks's analogy to Black life being more beautiful than the westernized signifier of beauty, the rose, is an example of ordinary being extraordinary. What remains a troubling rhetorical tactic by those who have not taken the care to interpret Gwendolyn Brooks's body of literature and situate these works within the scaffold of American history and its social and race paradigm is the proclamation of a drastic change in aesthetics. When I hear this sentiment, I'm wondering what happened to the quote, an artist should always be in a state of becoming. To read the work is to notice how she had actively nurtured her culture through language. What happened was she found a group of young people at Fisk University during the Black Writers Conference in the spring of 1967 that identified as she did, bold and beautifully, and was ready to receive her as cultural mother. Or as Cheryl Clark, the author of After Mecca, Women Poets in the Black Arts Movement writes, quote, she sought out the tutelage of the new Black with much the same spirit as she entered the poetry workshop run by Inez Cunningham at the Southside Community Center in 1941. Brooks was devout about poetry as a vehicle that could teach Black people about their history in the world as she herself was now being taught, unquote. It wasn't that Miss Brooks was not writing about Blackness, but more about her poetry evolving into something new. These critics then too postulate that there isn't a Black aesthetic because There isn't a white one. To deny the aesthetics of any ethnic group, be it Native American, Korean American, Mexican American, Indian American, and so forth, is to actively engage, as Addison Gill would describe, as the cultural strangulation of that group. Again, this is the outside self speaking, refusing to publicly acknowledge its empirical persuasion on the landscape of literature, consciously or unconsciously. The irony is that Ms. Brooks never wavers from a commitment to reporting from inside Black America, nor was the concept of other an active decision in her aesthetics. Ms. Brooks shows a propensity to articulate the only self she has known. This self is not only active, but can thereby be viewed as literary theory within the inner world, and as Barbara Christian has so eloquently put it, quote, people of race have always theorized in forms quite different from the Western form of abstract logic that unmask the powers relations of the world, unquote. What Brooks' aesthetic also shows is that her rootedness in poetics begins with African American culture, and thereby the reader becomes witness to these power relations through the poetic self she creates. This is her world, and she reports from it. However, it would be naive of us to think that Ms. Brooks's poetics isn't linguistically influenced by Western literature. What she does is use this tool to create windows in her own community for people to see themselves. Within her poetics, any literary or critical analysis will be able to deduct what the opposite or duality of her poems iterate by a mere explication. Earlier, I mentioned the poetics of Gwendolyn Brooks as theoretical foreshadowing. If we look at her Pulitzer Prize collection, Annie Allen, and the poem Truth, and later We Real Cool from the Bean Eaters, we can then see how Miss Brooks's construction of the self shows how the environment is the life shape of the body being language's didactic possibilities through historicity. Consider Truth, which talks about the sun coming and us being afraid or not understanding what this metaphorical representation of the sun can do. In the composition of the poem, one can look at her sun as a form of enlightenment. But towards the middle of the poem, she writes, quote, sweet it is to sleep in the coolness of snug unawareness, unquote. Meaning to have an opportunity to be enlightening is frightening, and the awareness that is desired creates an uncomfortability. Here, Ms. Brooks is critiquing the interior of her constructed self, to not be satisfied with not knowing and unawareness. Can you hear the echo here? Now, fast forward about 15 years to the Black Arts Movement and its affiliation with Malcolm X. The poet Etheridge Knight, a product of the Black Arts Movement and the affirmation of an inverted other that proclaims self to be center, hears the echo of Ms. Brooks' dialectics and continues that dialectical conversation nurtured by the environment in a poem that speaks about Ms. Brooks's son and how we didn't know what to do with it, just like she predicted. Please note, the real we is the company of African American culture, of all the forms of life within it, the primal wave of it, writing itself out in evolution, to borrow from the poet Robert Duncan. So in continuing with the evolution of Knight, writes, the sun came, Miss Brooks, after all the night years. He came splitting fire from his lips, and we flipped. We goofed the whole thing. This is the echo Miss Brooks creates with her poetry, the ripple that not only widens and widens within the pond of humanity. While Miss Brooks is quick to point out her constructed self's beauty by inner dialogue with the self, she is just as quick to divulge the ugly within the self as well. In essence, the ugly is derived from evil and guilt. However, ugly and beautiful are forever tied together. One cannot exist without the other. Therefore, what emerges as an ugly beauty or the terrible beauty. This is more than evident in the poem, We Real Cool. First of all, by incorporating the cultural we, Ms. Brooks has begun a dialogue with the inner self. The poem's architecture is that of economical precision with a heavy emphasis on the we. The poem goes on to discourse about the juxtaposition of the cool and what that ultimately means at all costs in some segments of Black America. The echo and ripple Miss Brooks creates magnifies the current discussion about the state of Black America and its infatuation of keeping it real at all costs to the extent that Black communities suffer from self-mutilation. This inverted self, this decentering of the outer world to an inner world where all is center, is how we should examine her work. To operate from a position of otherness is to deny one's basic humanity and freedom. I'm quite sure Gwendolyn Brooks doesn't want that. If we are to be the cultural sons and daughters of Miss Brooks, then we must use the cultural memory she has given us to create fuller selves and not think about ourselves as other, but complete full selves.